Okay, so Ria, you were saying that you weren't sure exactly how much of this was taught, and I was mentioning that, for myself, other than hearing Martin Luther King, I've never heard of any of those organizations. Um, and I'm curious to see, the organizations were out there in existence. How did it turn out that you became involved?
Well, first of all, they did send mailings. They did
Ah,
advertise, like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference sent a lot of mailings and asked for donations and let people know what they were doing. Particularly Martin Luther King, of course, was followed by the media very, very closely. And you would send money, and they would send, they would send you information about where they were meeting. And a lot of people, I did not go down south because I had two small children at the time, but a lot of people did. A lot of people went down and joined what was going on in Alabama and Montgomery and the lunch counters. And it was a really concerted effort to make something change in this country in a very non-violent, peaceful way. And I think that has to really be underscored. It isn't that the police were so friendly, I mean, it's not that people saw the police as friendly. They certainly weren't, and there are plenty of films of people's heads being bashed in, and especially in southern cities. And of course, in order to integrate the schools, they had to call out the military. The governor asked for that to happen because the people in the town they didn't want this. They just did not want black people being equal with them, eating at their lunch counters. And so we all marched. What we would hear, oh, they're having a march down Fifth Avenue for whatever it was, or somebody's going to be talking at such and such a place. And we wanted to hear these people talk. We wanted to hear what they had to say, because we really believed that America could really change and that we could make it change.
so when you would go to these things, would you go with a girlfriend? Would you
Yeah,
bring
we
your
would go with a
children?
group. We would go with a few people. Not everybody was willing to go because people were frightened.
Right.
They were really frightened, and they were afraid that they were going to get hurt. But there was more the excitement that you were doing something, that you could have your voice really heard. And you did not think that you would get hurt in the real sense that I think people think today, because I think because it was nonviolent. People respected that. They knew that it had to be nonviolent. And remember, Gandhi in India had already happened
Right.
already, so there was already a model
Right.
for
Violence.
nonviolent
Yeah.
demonstrations. So that's what people wanted, and they really wanted to change the country. I mean, it was mostly black people. The difference that you see today is that the crowds that you see are white and black and brown and every other persuasion of human being. If you look at the films, mostly they were black people marching, for their freedom. But they did it with a kind of dignity. I mean, there was a sense of that they were entitled to. I mean, I remember when Rosa Parks wouldn't get off the bus. It was like, it was unbelievable. Nobody believed that this
Right.
woman had the courage
Right.
to do this.
Do you remember how you found out about that?
It was definitely it was on the news. It definitely was on the news. As soon as it happened, it was picked up. See, there were journalists that were following all of this all the time, and they, just like they are now,
Right.
they would go down south, and as soon as they heard something was happening, they immediately followed it and tried, and made a
Right.
story out of it. And suddenly, the northern newspapers were really a great aid. I mean, the big northern newspapers were a great aid in showing us what was happening. Photographs, the photojournalists
Right.
who showed the kids at lunch counters having their heads smashed in. I mean, we actually did not believe that was happening in this country.
Right.
I mean, it was like oh my God, I mean, how could that be happening here in the United States?
Right. And what was your experience, compared to that in New York City? So, I mean, when you went into a drugstore lunch counter, did you just see, was it completely integrated at that time?
It was integrated as far as the laws went, and people did not refuse service.
Gotcha.
But people were not necessarily treated equally. I mean, you could be on a line in a drugstore, and if you were a black person and maybe you were number 3 online, you might get waited on number 10 because
That's the way it is.
that's the way it is. And I mean, of course, the redlining and housing has always been an issue in the North, where you go for an apartment and the apartment is rented. But then various groups, government groups, set up where they would send a couple in, and the couple would, a mixed couple or a black couple, and they would go to rent the apartment, and they would be told, oh, the apartment is rented. And then they would send a white couple in, and the white couple would get the apartment, and they would sue them. So there were attempts to try to make that better.
Right.
But it's happened. There has been some movement. There is absolutely no question that there has been some movements. There are more black people going to college than ever before.
Right.
So there are more black people that have moved into good paying jobs because they have the education. There are, I was just reading that still the number of CEOs that exist among black people in corporations or companies is still infinitesimal compared to white people.
There's no doubt. I mean, progress absolutely needs to be made. As we're sitting here, I'm trying to do the math in my head. I mean, we're talking, we're in 2020, so you're talking about a time period that's at least 50 years ago?
It's more than that. I am 83. I was in my very, very early 20s. You're talking about 60. You're talking about 60
years ago, and the progress is small.
It's very, very small. And the issues that, so there was Brown versus the Board of Education to try to integrate schools. But the schools were not, in many, many, many places, including New York City, were never equal. The people who had money and lived in areas that had money, they could give more money in taxes to their boards of education. They could have better education. The buildings that the black people lived in, and I was teaching school at the time, were older, more decrepit. The books were worse. The best teachers didn't want to be in those schools because the kids were behind in reading, and maybe you had some behavioral problems with the children. Although I have to say that I taught in Bed-Stuy, which is an all black, or was at the time an all black area. A lot of these areas have been gentrified, since that time. And I also taught in the Upper West Side near Columbia, and that was a relatively mixed school, although a lot of the professors sent their kids to private schools. But the kids were behind. Their parents could not help them. When I hear you and Sarah talk about going home to help your kids, you have the ability to help your kids.
Right.
It's like 100 years ago when people's parents didn't speak English.
Right.
And they came home from school and mother couldn't help them because they didn't even know the language. Well, these kids have the same problem because their parents don't have the educational base to help them, especially with all the newfangled,
So, I mean, what I hear you saying in that is that a part of what motivated you or motivates you towards this is seeing these struggles firsthand. So you literally observed this, you lived this, you taught in these areas,
Yes.
You had firsthand, visualization and, experience with seeing the challenges and the differences. So it gave you perspective.
Absolutely.
What, of all of the memories that you have, what do you think one of the most poignant is for you as relates to this?
Well, one of the biggest one was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in
Oh gosh.
1963. That's when Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, which was extremely powerful. But one of the more intimate memories I have is at that time, Arthur and I, my husband, were living on Riverside Drive near Columbia, and there was a point at which they should have put a light, and they didn't. And we wrote letters, and it was unbelievable. They wouldn't put a light on, and a black man went across the street and he got killed. And that really organized the neighborhood.
Ah.
And my husband used to say we stopped flying Freddy. Well, that meant there was a guy with a helicopter who used to track the traffic on one of the TV channels.
Yeah.
And we stopped the traffic. We marched, of course, with baby carriages and whatever we could. And it was Riverside Drive at maybe 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And,
Right.
and that was very powerful. I think that really taught me that people really have to speak up. People really cannot allow themselves to just accept the status quo, because if they do, nothing is going to change. And in that sense, I still believe in democracy. I mean, I still believe in the power of the people.
Right. So you and Arthur were in lockstep on your views on this?
Absolutely. He worked for a number of anti-poverty programs and youth and work programs, which they really have to do now, because they took kids who were unemployed and they trained them in things like the automotive trade and other kinds of very practical kinds of things, and helped them get a GED and that kind of thing. And all those programs just disappeared.
Right.
They don't seem to exist, and voc ed programs don't seem to exist anymore. But it's more in attitude. See, I was on Facebook the other day with the son of somebody who lives here, and he is very, very, very conservative. And she always says that. Don't talk to my son, he's very conservative. And he said something on Facebook about liberals, which when people say the word liberal makes my blood boil,
Right.
And so I knew it wouldn't pay to answer him, but I did it anyway. And I said, so what do you suggest as a solution? I mean, you're identifying what you think is the problem. What do you say? Well, people have to go to work. They have to stop having children. They have to, they have to go to school. They have to do all of this. I said, well, where do you think all of this came from? Why do you think we have all these problems in this country? I mean, the people a baby who's born isn't creating this problem. They don't know what they're born into.
Right.
And then he answered some, other kinds of things, because it's very hard to move people away from that attitude, because I think either they believe that their taxes are going to some nefarious place for people, and it's not true, by the way. You would never in a million years want to have to raise your family on welfare. You would, I mean, it's just incredible. There just is no money for anything. And I mean, I wouldn't want to be on welfare unless, unless there was illness or something that forced you to be on it. I don't know I worked in child welfare, as you know, for many years. I never knew anybody that had children just so they could get more money.
Right. And I agree with that. So, I mean, you have so much perspective on this. You must feel feelings with seeing what's going on right now.
Oh.
Does it feel like deja vu, or does it feel worse or different?
It's very different, because, as I said, there were organizations that had been around for a long time, like the NAACP has been around for, 100 years or something. And they were at the forefront of anti-lynching kinds of legislation. So, I mean, they have a history, and people joining them, and you can, criticize maybe they haven't been as active. And so, but there were these groups with these people that were leaders, and people could follow them. What I see now is, and I was thinking this the other day, when we went to a demonstration, we went to a point, like they would say, we're going to meet in Bryant Park in Manhattan, and everybody would go to Bryant Park, and there would be a march to get there and whatever.
Right.
And people would speak, and singers like Joan Baez would sing.
Right.
And now what you see is people running away from the police. I mean,
Right.
you know, they go here and the police follow them to stop them,
Right.
and then they go there and they start a fire. And
Well, I think that's such a great point now that you're saying it, because when I think about what I've learned in textbooks and in history, there's an organization or there's a person that's associated with starting a movement.
mm-hmm.
You know, right now when you think about this, the one person that I see associated with, you know, something so publicly is Colin Kaepernick,
Mm-hmm.
the football player that kneeled.
Sure.
I feel like when you were going through this 60 years ago, there might have been more people like Colin Kaepernick that were out there leading this. So the question is that what we need? Do we need to have those individual people or those organizations coming out more strongly and taking a stand? Is that a difference between now and then?
I think it is, because I think that some of what needs to be done is definitely legislation. I mean, from what I've been reading about certain kinds of immunity that the police have in certain areas, I think that you're never going to get any legislation passed if you don't have somebody who's going to lead that movement, because that's the way things happen. It happens under some kind of influence or some kind of threat, you know, and quite frankly, the Republicans, you know, don't want to lose power. I mean, and so they are going to support the president as long as they possibly can.
Right, and of course, this being an election year, it compounds everything.
Absolutely.
So I think the last thing I'd like you to just reflect on or think about, Rea, is what would you say to yourself now? Your 20-year-old self, or my children, or
my
me,
granddaughter,
or your granddaughter.
I say you have to get involved. You have to educate yourself. You have to understand the history. You have to understand this is just not a point in time that's just isolated. I really think that teaching kids about the history of the United States and being honest about it. We have never been honest about our history. I mean, when I think about the fact that Germany has an educational program for the Holocaust and teaches every kid about it. In this country, we deny the fact that, you know, we took land away from Native Americans. We enslaved black people. I mean, for 400 years, if you go back to 1600,
Right.
we don't talk about that.
No, it's whitewashed. The stories are, you know, given from the perspective of progress and growth in the United States, and they focus on the cotton gin and the innovation.
Yes.
But, you know, you're absolutely right.
I mean, you have to, schools are responsible for teaching that kind of history, because I do believe until we own that, until we really own that, we will not make the kind of progress that we need to be able to make. That, you know, that I always encourage my grandchildren to get involved, but I think one of the things that I see that is very different today is people are much more involved in survival, in education, getting a job where they can support themselves. That is all so much harder than it was when I was going to school. I mean, it's I can't believe what it costs to go to college. I can't believe what my children are paying for their children to go to college. It's like every year it's somebody's salary, a family salary.
We're buying a house.
Yes.
You know.
And I think that something has to be done about that. I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I do think that people have to be able to talk to each other. And to that end, I just want to mention one thing. I called both Tim Rogers and Neil Bettis the other day and asked them.
Go ahead.
Oh, and asked them.
Can you just give us 5 minutes? Just 5 minutes. Go ahead.
And asked them, saying that I don't come from this area and I don't know what the issues are in this area, but I can imagine, given that there's like a 40% poverty rate in Ulster County, there are problems and issues.
Right.
And I would just like to know more about it and see whether there's any place that I could make a contribution.
Yeah.
And so a woman by the name of Kathy Sanchez, who's supposed to be very active in all of this in the schools, called me, and she actually told me about some of the problems that do exist in New Paltz.
Yeah, I talked to Tim and Neil on either Monday or Wednesday this week. We have weekly calls now, and they mentioned that a resident had called and reached out. They're actually going to be planning on doing a meeting with residents, like virtually, that we can also air on TV because they're inspired by your phone call. They didn't say it was you, so I'm glad that you let me know. But they're inspired by that, and I think that if we can do something as a community or as individuals, we need to.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things we need to do is to be able to face each other and talk about how you really feel.
Right.
When Arthur and I worked for Daytop Village, and again, this goes back many years, the Anti-Defamation League gave a training. I told Tim that I would look it up and do some research, and I did. And it turns out that they don't train adults anymore. They're concentrating on schools. And this woman, as Kathy told me, they are using one of the curriculums in the middle school. You know, I said to him, it was probably one of the more meaningful experiences of my life because the training made you look inside yourself. It made you make choices. Like if you were hiring two people who were absolutely equal in every way, educational, age-wise,
Right.
finance, you know, how would you make that decision? You know, and it made people really look inside and see, well, do I have any bias here?
Right.
Would I choose a white person over a black person? Would I be more
Right.
comfortable working with a,
Right.
you know? And I've never forgotten that. I think that black people and white people have to sit around a table and really talk about their experiences. What is it like to live in New Paltz?
Right.
You know,
Right.
you know, what is
Right.
it like? What are the police like when something happens? I
Right.
mean, you know.
And I think that goes right back to the point that we made earlier, which is that a lot of your perspective came from seeing it firsthand.
Absolutely.
So I think that that's a fantastic, you know, opportunity that maybe we should really start thinking about how can we make that happen at Woodland Pond. You know, we're doing the Sage Table events with the LGBTQ issues. We partnered with the LGBTQ Community Center to have those roundtable discussions between residents and folks in the LGBTQ community. Why couldn't we do the same thing with folks in the brown and black community?
We could if you
and
can
our
reach them.
staff, you know, I've invited them to participate in this program to anybody
Great.
that wants to. You know, we have so many young people here. I think we actually have an opportunity to maybe do something. So I appreciate your participation today.
Thank you.
I respect what you've done enormously. I am so thankful that we're doing this because I think hearing these stories from the residents firsthand, so much more. It's so different than a textbook.
Oh,
So
my
for me,
God.
it's been personally very enlightening, and I really appreciate everything that you've done in participating today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
It was my
Rea.
pleasure. Thank you, Michelle.